This might be easier.
Okay. Do you want me to share my screen or do you want to share the screen?
Either one, you decide. I can share.
Okay.
Welcome to EAC South's 2022 convening, our strand on translanguaging for social justice. What next? Where do we go from here? Joining me today is Dr. Mariana Castro, and I will let her introduce herself.
Thank you, Liz. My name is Mariana Castro, and I'm currently serving as Deputy Director for the Wisconsin Center for Education Research, which is located at UW-Madison. I'm also a researcher and lead developer for WIDA. I've been in education for over 30 years, specifically in curriculum instruction, focusing on language development. I've also served in teacher preparation and a lot of professional learning. In my research, I love to integrate my background as an educator and my passion for working with multilingual children, youth, and their teachers. I have a really big commitment to social justice. Since 2006, I've also worked for WIDA, and I've directed their professional learning standards, the standards department. And I'm currently doing research that is focused on language development for multilingual children. I've worked a lot in the development of WIDA standards and other related initiatives. And I've published, but I think the most important thing for me is that I'm the lucky mom of Amy, Amelia, Andres, and Diego.
Bravo. I'm so honored that you're with us today. My name is Dr. Lizdelia Piñón, and I was one of the organizers for the strand on translanguaging for social justice, alongside Dr. Zulema Carrion Sanchez and the wonderful Dr. Mariana Castro. I'm an education associate at IDRA EX South. The IDRA EX South is one of 4 federally funded centers that provide technical assistance and training at the request of school district and other responsible government agencies to build capacity of our local educators to ensure a more equitable learning environment for all our students. We have done this for almost 5 decades. My mom was a bilingual educator in San Lorenzo, Puerto Rico, and migrated to Chicago in the 70s, where she studied at the University of Illinois and later became one of the founding teachers of one of the first dual language programs in Chicago. She taught in Chicago Public School for over 25 years. So I was a dual language student from preschool until 8th grade. And I've been in the field of education for over 20 years. So I can say basically my whole life I've been in the field of bilingual education. But the same as Dr. Castro, my most important hat that I carry is being mama to Gabriel, who's 18, and my 9-year-old triplets, Felicita, Frida, and Santiago, who are living miracles, having been born at 25 weeks, only weighing 1 pound. They're currently Texas students in a dual language program, and they also have special education needs. So what's our agenda today? We are going to talk about why and where. We're going to show an example of sample implementation. We're going to talk about landscape, summary, a little bit of planning, and how do we bring it all together during our time together. So you might ask yourself, why? Why are we doing this? Social justice, right? Just like Dr. Castro said, she's been a proponent of social justice. So have I. Social justice is interpreted as social and civic responsibilities commitment to promoting the common good, and participation in the democratic process and cultural diversity. A social justice approach includes investigating those barriers to students' learning outcomes and using teaching assessment strategies fairly. Students within a socially just pedagogic framework should not be impacted negatively by discrimination through sex, language, culture, ethnicity, religion, or disability. So Fraser's framework highlighted this need for both redistribution and recognition, social equality, and the recognition of the difference to achieve this social justice. So I'm just giving you a little bit of research behind the why of our strand. And it's a shift from justice, from redistribution to justice for recognition. In other words, putting a focus on social cultural groups who are struggling to defend their identities and cultural domination and win recognition. So when applied to language, this idea of linguistic human rights, there's a growing literature that's moving from looking at language policies to human rights approach. Basically, anything around language and education should be regarded as a right. Language rights are human rights. So that's how we land here. So rompiendo linguistic and cultural barreras, right? That's where we're at right now. Texas in 1960s had a lot of overt discrimination against Mexican Americans. These are some of the signs that hung in different areas in Texas, right? We have this idea of linguicism, right? Where we're only wanting everyone to speak English only. No dogs or Mexicans allowed. It's hard to believe that this used to be acceptable. While these signs were taken down long ago, anti-immigrant attitudes have persisted, particularly against Mexican immigrants, right? And in the late 1960s, thankfully, we have civil rights movements, Bilingual Education Act, but here we are still fighting for this movement, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about linguistic oppression. Actually, I'm going to show a video of one of my favorite educators and mentor, Dr. Jose Medina, because he says it perfectly. And Dr. Castro, let me know that.
Just a reminder that when we tell a child, a student, one another as adults, you don't say it that way. No se dice así. That's the moment that we become the linguistic oppressor. When we tell a child, a student, one another as adults, escoge un idioma, choose a language, don't mix the two, don't leverage Spanglish or Chinglish, don't use Ave to our Black students. That's the moment that we embrace linguistic oppression.
So what were your thoughts on that? And I would like for you to share on the chat your thoughts on this. How do you respond to this video that you just saw about linguistic oppression? Is this happening in our classrooms right now? So translanguaging in education accepts the whole child, right? It's not a Spanish classroom with a Spanish-speaking teacher or an English classroom with an English-speaking teacher where you're only speaking English or Spanish. A child brings all of their language repertoire, right? His Spanish, his English, his sign, his Ave, whatever it is he brings into that classroom. So translanguaging in education is an educational context. It's situated within a constructivist and a culturally and linguistic responsive pedagogy that honors the richness, complexity, and fullness of a student's linguistic repertoire, right? It accepts all of it. It's translanguaging creates a learning space for emergent bilinguals that more fully realizes the possibilities of this social justice. It does this by shifting the discourse away from this deficit model that we see here to this model of translanguaging spaces. So, what are those translanguaging spaces? As you've heard in the past 4 or 5 sessions, these spaces are allowed for students to experience empowering, they're adaptable, they're relevant, they're reactive of life experiences. Translanguaging recognizes a formal equality among all the languages and our languaging features and practices, because these features are situated as part of a complete system. As the image show, it's fully owned by its user. Like translanguaging, social justice education challenges us to expand these traditional forms of thinking and use culturally linguistic responsive and sustaining pedagogy to create greater equity in access and achievement for all of our students. Translanguaging is an essential part of this approach.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for this wonderful introduction. And now we're going to shift a little, and I want to give you a little bit of background of the landscape of language practices. And I have del dicho al hecho, no? Del dicho al hecho. It's a saying in Spanish that means from what you say to what you do, there's a gap, right? So this study that I was working on, I've been working on over the last few years, it's about that gap. What is it? What are the practices that we're having or we're seeing in schools, or the teachers are reporting themselves, and how does that compare to the work that academics and that our own society is doing? So if you don't mind going to the next slide, Liz, I have these pictures, and these pictures, I live in Wisconsin. So in Wisconsin, as you can imagine, there are a lot of English speakers, but there are a lot of there's a lot of diversity. We have a large Hmong population. We have a large Spanish-speaking population, and this is the context in which a lot of our students live. Right? You can see that both the government, social agencies, they're trying to reach multiple audiences that sometimes speak various languages. So the use of language out in our communities is flexible and it's fluid. As you walk down the street, you're going to see things in multiple languages or in different languages. As you surf the internet, which a lot of our students do, or even as you interact with friends or family, you are stepping in and out of different spaces that may have different linguistic ways of communicating. So for many people in our community, translanguaging is just part of you being multilingual. If we could go to the next slide. So the way I'm going to talk about translanguaging today is going to be from 3 different aspects, 3 different perspectives. So when you think about translanguaging, you can come at translanguaging, and as you can see at the bottom, as a worldview, right? That is the foundation of the ways we think about things, the way we act on things. So we're going to explore translanguaging as just a lens that we use to look at the world and make sense of what's going on. We're also going to talk about translanguaging as a pedagogical practice, about something that we as educators do in our classrooms and how we might take that worldview and apply it. And most important, we're going to talk about it as a language practice, something that bilingual and multilingual children and youth and adults, we all do. So as you can see, like the pedagogical practice is in the middle, right? And we want to talk about how we see the world, but we also want to bring how children see themselves. So we're going to look at these 3 aspects of translanguaging. Now we can go to the next slide. I'm going to give you a few seconds to read this slide. This summarizes a lot of the work that has been done around translanguaging in terms of research. A lot of people have explored why. Why do students translanguage as a practice? There's this scholar called Suresh Kanagaraja, and what he did is he looked at how students were code meshing, how they were changing languages or using all of their languages in writing. And sometimes in the process of writing. So even when their final paper was going to be in one or another language, there was a lot of mixing of language before they got to that final language. And this was back in 2011. So it's over 10 years ago. There's a very kind of like it's one of the classical translanguaging articles from Blackledge and Crease, again, over 20 years ago, about how translanguaging is typical in oral interactions. When you meet with somebody else who speaks your language, your languages, you feel free to go back and forth to create a better sense of the message. And then Willie, who has been also a tremendous contributor to translanguaging, about 10 years ago, talked about translanguaging for people who are bilingual, using it to challenge the conventional ways that we use language and to challenge conventional language boundaries. It's really hard to keep nowadays languages pure, right? Because we're looking at the internet, we're meeting people from across the world online. We're, I live in the States, but I have family in Mexico. So these transnational connections that we have are making us go back and forth with language. I tend to do research about Spanish, the Spanish-speaking world in the US. Anytime you speak Spanish in the US, you're also in contact with English. So at this point, if you're joining us in front of video, if you're watching this, I would pause the video right now and do a quick write for you to think about what are some of the examples of translanguages that you have observed in your classroom, in your school, in your own community. And for us, we will go to the next slide. So
we do have about 10 people in here, Dr. Castro.
Oh, so how about I give you about 2 minutes? I'm going to set it up and I'm going to have you first write. This is just for yourself. You don't have to share it. Find a place where you're taking notes for today and write down how might you use language. How do you see language being used in your community? We will use these notes later. So a couple minutes. Okay, so hopefully you have a list started. We're going to come back to this list and we're going to be thinking more about translanguaging. But, I want to say that we sometimes do use translanguaging when we don't know a particular word. But most of the time we use translanguaging in different ways. If I were to say to Liz, hey, let's go for a cafecito, there's a certain understanding that, we're going to go somewhere, we're going to connect, we're going to talk. We might or might not drink coffee. I actually don't drink coffee, but I'll have a tea. But a cafecito has this, bigger meaning than just little coffee. A little coffee is this special time. I know that she will understand what it means to go for a cafecito versus somebody else. I might say, hey, do you want to meet and chat? Right? So sometimes we use words for a particular connection when we know that happens. But now let's go to the next slide. And I wanted to talk about how we use translanguaging in teaching and learning. If you remember, we're going back to that triangle. And now we're in the sense. Yes, we all use translanguaging in our lives, but how can we as educators take advantage of translanguaging in teaching and learning? I'm going to be quiet for just like 10 seconds so you can read this. So as teachers, we have options, right? We have students who are multilingual. Many times they come with 2 languages, and sometimes they come with multiple languages. When I was teaching in high school, we often had Spanish speakers who came to us, but they actually spoke indigenous languages from throughout Latin America, and that was their first language. So sometimes, because they have experienced linguicism in their own context, in their own homes, in their own, and when I'm talking about homes, their own communities, when they come to us, they say, I'm bilingual, and they identify with that Spanish language. So in terms of talking about multilingualism, it's important to just come to recognize that there might be languages that are visible and there might be languages that are invisible for many different reasons, right? So for me as an educator, one of the things I have to be thinking about is what are those invisible languages? And they could be language varieties too, right? That students have been told they do not belong here, right? That students might have heard from students kind of like Dr. Medina said, así no se dice. That's not the way we say it, right? So how can we use it in strategic ways for reading complex text, for discussing complex ideas or concepts, or for creating text that can appeal to different audiences, right? Because we do it in multiple different languages or language varieties. As teachers, we also have to choose, right? When do I provide flexibility and choice in language use? And when do I help students kind of move or translate into a different register? And when I say translate, I'm not saying just from one language to another, but from one register to another, which includes this thinking about what is the purpose for this communication? What are the languages that my audiences are going to connect with, right? And in the same way that we talk about literacy as multi-literacy, that because kids nowadays, they get information not just from text, right? But there's oral text, there's video, there's online, and they have to really process multiple different modalities at the same time. Some of those modalities might be in multiple different languages. So the idea of translanguaging can also be found in multimodal text. And finally, if they are getting information in those ways, they also can learn how to produce information in those ways. Why? Because different audiences are going to rely in different ways of communicating. So let's go to the third one, because we talked about, if you remember, language practices from the student perspective. We talked at it from the perspective of educators. And now let's think about, still as educators, but what does it mean to have a worldview that is translingual? And this morning, or if you're seeing this as a video, the presentation prior to us talked about translanguaging in a very particular way. And I loved what Dr. Susana Ivara Johnson has done with this idea of pedagogical clarity. And this, I'm spending a little bit of time of this because you're going to see how the research that I share with you talks about that ideology. As teachers, we come into the classroom and we have certain ways in which we've been taught how to teach. And some of those ways are just our experience. If you remember your first grade experience or your second grade experience, your kindergarten, whatever you remember, that has stayed with you. And we've had 13 years plus of just being inducted in particular ways of teaching. So if you grew up like me in a very traditional school setting, I learned that you teach by saying, that you teach by memorizing, that you teach by writing things over and over and over, right? We know so much more about education right now, but sometimes our old worldview kind of sips into it, right? So what I'm talking about, a worldview, is that the way that the filter, the way that you in your mind really hold what teaching is, what your pedagogical perspective is, some people talk about teaching philosophy or pedagogical stance. How does that align with what you do in the classroom? When I was a chemistry teacher, I would say, okay, now go to work in groups. And what would happen is that kids would start talking to each other. Imagine talking to each other about chemistry. That's the way we learn, right? But I had in my mind, remember I talked about my student life. We were supposed to be quiet. Classrooms were quiet. We weren't supposed to speak. So many times I would catch myself about to say, keep it quiet. I wanted to tell people to keep the level down, the volume down. But if kids were really trying to create connections, if kids were really trying to, make meaning of what they were observing, they needed to talk. Learning is really an interactive activity. It's not neutral, but it's interactive. So for many teachers, when they have translanguage as a worldview, you have to compare, okay, if I do believe that these children have a whole repertoire, if I believe that kids should be able to use this whole repertoire, I need to make sure that my practice reflects that, right? If I say Yes, kids can't cut themselves and, into two different languages. If they speak two languages, they're two monolinguals in one. But then I go and I never allow them to think across languages. Then my practice is not matching my philosophy, right? So how do I do that? How do I give opportunities in the curriculum, in those activities that I create or I design? How do I create a worldview around that is translingual in the connections that I make between what we're learning and the real world, or in what we're learning and personal connections, or in what I'm learning and other texts? In the way that I scaffold instruction, in the ways that I support students getting to really understand the concept. Am I using translanguaging? Am I using translanguaging in assessment? If what I'm assessing is the content, am I allowing students to tell me about the content in any language that they speak, right? And again, how am I using translanguaging to show that my classroom, in my classroom, we do social justice work? So these are things for us to think about as we're thinking, okay, this is what I believe as a teacher, and this is what I practice as a teacher. How much alignment there is. I'm not saying this is easy work, right? Because we have policies, because we have goals for instruction, but it's a matter of how do I weave this in, because I believe that this is the way, these are assets that the students bring. How am I leveraging? If I believe this is an asset, how am I leveraging that asset in teaching and learning? Okay, now we can go to the next slide. So after all this, the reason why I give you this is because this is the stuff that we're thinking about as academics, that we're thinking about as educators, and that we bring people to think about. But we spend a lot of time in universities by ourselves doing research. So my question was, okay, if this is how we've come to understand translanguaging, how are teachers in classrooms understanding translanguaging? Is it similar? Is it different? There's a lot of research that talks about gaps, right? Sometimes because academics are researching, are like innovation at the edge of innovation, there's always a gap between what's happening in the classrooms and what is happening in journals and academic writing. So I was very interested in this. I wanted to know, how do bilingual educators define translanguaging? I purposely left it as bilingual educators. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you a little insight, because I wanted to talk to classroom teachers, but I also wanted to know what paraprofessionals were doing, what language specialists were doing. And I wanted to know, is like, okay, there's this word translanguaging. How do you define it? Then I wanted to know about ideologies. What is it that you say you believe about language in instruction, about language in learning, right? And assessment. So I had a section in the survey to talk about, or to ask about what they believe, what they valued about translanguaging, about bilingual. And then I also wanted to capture what particular practices, if any, were being used by educators in bilingual programs. So I'm going to tell you about what I found. So we can go to the next slide.
And I was super excited about this survey and this background.
And a little bit of the background of this survey. At the time, I was working full-time at WIDA, and we worked a lot. We worked very closely with the Center for Applied Linguistics. And we, when I say we work together, it's really we geek out together. So we sit down and we have these quarterly meetings where we look for opportunities for collaboration. And this was the question that we were wondering about. So we created the survey, but then when I wanted to disseminate the survey, the Center for Applied Linguistics and WIDA did a great job. They helped us disseminate it. So they put it in their website. We are also part of the National Dual Language Forum. We gave it to them. And as part of that forum, you have NAB, you have TAB, you have CAB, you have different organizations across the United States who work with bilingual learners. So we put it out there into the whole field, and we got about 967 people who responded. The people who completed the whole survey were 447. So what I'm going to show you is going to be based on the 447, because what we wanted to do is we wanted to be able to compare. Okay, you said you believed in this in the multiple choice section. This is what you shared about defining translanguaging or your practices in the open survey. You know, there were places where people were writing. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So first of all, who participated in this survey? As you can see, the majority were classroom teachers and language specialists. This is the one thing is like some people marked 2. So they were both classroom teachers and language specialists. So they had like an ESL certification or a bilingual certification. We did have a good representation of administrators. And we had some people who were bilingual coaches or bilingual. They work with teachers in the classroom. And then we had, as you can see, other smaller percentages of people who were consultants or people who were working in colleges. But so for some of the papers that we're working on from this study, we filter. So we said, let's just see what classroom teachers are saying, or let's see what classroom teachers and language specialists are saying. So that's the nice thing about having a survey, that you can cut the data in different ways. Okay, so let's keep going. In the next slide, I'm going to show you, okay, these were teachers, but where were they working? And it's hard to see here because I wanted to give you the numbers. You have the types of programs. In the first column that you see, that's the percentage. And in the last column, you see the actual number of respondents. So for these respondents, as you can see, the majority of them were in bilingual programs. They were either in one-way or two-way bilingual programs or transitional bilingual programs. It was very interesting to see the English-only representation. And we'll talk about findings later, but English-only representation, teachers who were working in English-only did a lot with translanguaging, which, you know, sometimes you say, like, if you have bilingual students, this might be an opportunity for bilingual programs. But in bilingual schools, they weren't quite really thinking about how I'm going to use this. So that was just of interest. We can go to the next slide. The other interesting thing is, like, from those who responded, were they bilingual? Well, the majority were at least bilingual. You can see here, the very dark is the multilingual. The medium blue is bilingual. And really, it was a very small group of people who were only monolingual. And we can go to the next slide. So what were the main themes? Our first question was, how do you define translanguaging? Before they answer any other questions. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to capture their first ideas. We didn't want them to be kind of biased as they were answering the other questions. So things that they talked about is 2 languages. People knew that translanguaging, whatever it meant, it had to deal with 2 languages. There were several people who understood translanguages as an integrated language system. So, and this is important. And this is where I talk about what is it that you believe and what is it that you do. Some people think, oh yeah, translanguages is an integrated language system, but you still talk about language transfer, right? If there's transfer between languages, that means that you believe that there are multiple languages. If you think that it's a single system, that there might be multiple languages in the single system, they all live in the same. So it's more about leveraging some strengths more than others. A lot of people saw it as a tool for learning, right? A lot of people talked about, this is how I use it. And I separated tool for learning from pedagogical tool in this respect. Like, tools for learning is something that they just use for this particular purpose. Like, so that they understand directions or that they understand what they're supposed to do. But the pedagogical tool is like, how do I help it for deeper understanding? So that got more into mental processes. And there were not as many, but some people recognize translanguaging not just as a strategy to do, but they saw it as a way to support equity or even challenge the perceived ways in which we see students or that we see language. So that was interesting. We can go to the next one. Now, so people had completed what they thought translanguaging was. Then there were about 30 questions that were multiple choice about what they saw as benefits of translanguaging, about what they believe translanguaging was good for or not good for. And at the very end, we said, now give us some examples of what you do in your classroom that is translanguaging. So they had now time to think about it on their own, and they had time to see lots of examples. And for the people who use translanguaging, these were some of the themes. A lot of people used it to support comprehension. So you had everything from, understanding what the directions are to understanding what a text was. A lot of people use it to develop vocabulary. That's why those two are in bold. And just as mattering if people use it for contrasting analysis or for transferring concepts or for honoring students' languages, classroom management. So what was interesting is that a lot of people talked about, for example, social justice when they said, do you believe translanguaging is one way of challenging monolingual ideologies? And everybody was like, yeah. But when it came time to talk about how do you actually use it, that was not part of their practices. So again, there was this kind of gap, not just between what the academics were doing, but between what I believed and what I do. And as a matter of fact, sometimes we had some examples where the teacher was defining translanguaging in like high, like social justice language. And then what they were doing with translanguaging was classroom management. So as you can see there, the tough thing about surveys is that you can't go back to that one person and ask them, why? Or what do you mean? Because we don't know anything else about the context. We know some things about their context, but we don't know about their policies. We don't know about what their arrangement is, who is in their classroom, who's not in their classroom. So we found that really interesting. And now we can go to the next slide. So for us, translanguaging is not the first concept or lens that people use to think about social justice, right? People have done a lot on cultural and linguistic sustaining pedagogy. The work of Latson Billings that was on culturally responsive pedagogy has been taken up by Paris Django and by others to think about sustaining pedagogies and adding that linguistic part, right? There has been a lot of work on critical approaches to language development. There's a lot of critical language awareness. You can see what Nelson Flores has done. A lot of people have talked about it. Even before this, we knew from, do you remember Fonts of Knowledge? If you're a teacher, you might have like a little tattoo. Fonts of Knowledge rocks, right? So Fonts of Knowledge was all about assets-based, right? So we knew that the linguistic part, the language, was part of those assets. There has been even people before then, before Fonts of Knowledge, who were looking at what we were doing with communities and empowering women, etc., around language. So translanguaging is not the first time we talk about multiple languages or the first time that we talk about social justice, but it moves us forward. It moves us forward in ways that we haven't been moved forward for a long time. Many times when I talk to other educators that I work with, there's a sense to go back to 40 years from ago when we were talking about separating academic language from social language, right? So there was a time we used to like to dichotomize things. So translanguaging is not about dichotomizing things, but about bringing things together. How do we bring those assets that children have, and what does that look like in the classroom? So now we can go to the next slide. And I'm going to hand it over back. We have a lot of fun to have still, but I'm going to hand it back to Liz.
Dr. Castro, and I really love that visual of the three rings. That's so powerful to me. And I'm sure we'll be using that in the future too.
Yeah, and let me just tell you, this is kind of like a summary of how to see translanguaging, but it's not necessarily the right way approach to look at it. Because, for example, it's really hard to see what is common between social justice and cultural and linguistic pedagogy. And are there things that don't include critical language approaches? But the key is like at the third, in the center. It's like really when we're talking about social justice, we need to talk about sustaining pedagogies that focus on culture and language. And that's what we forget to do sometimes. And when we're talking about social justice and we're talking about sustaining pedagogies, we need to look at language in critical ways. And when I say critical ways, I'm not saying criticizing, but thinking about power inequities, right? When we go into a school that is bilingual and you look around, what is the language on the walls? If I'm a parent who doesn't speak the English and I come in, who receives me, right? When I see the student work, what gets done? Sometimes when we assess, what are we assessing? Because what we assess is what we say counts, right? So all these things is not necessarily to separate, but to bring together. So I just wanted to give you kind of like a
No, and I agree.
of that.
You know, part of our work with the EX Center is that we do equity walks. And in December, I went inside a school, and like 80% of the kids spoke Haitian Creole. And there was not one sign in the whole school. There was not one staff member who spoke Haitian Creole.
Yeah.
So what is that telling our families?
Yeah.
You know, and what needs to change? Those are the conversations
Yeah.
that we brought up with that particular district. How do those parents feel walking into that classroom?
Yeah. Or
And
you know what? The other one
I get excited about that.
is the library. Going to the library and say, where are my Spanish books, or where are my Hmong books, or my Chinese books? And sometimes it's like one shelf versus like all the other English.
And then they're old. They're not
And
even
they're old. So you need
excited.
to be thinking, like, like I remember Crash, and the first time that I heard him, I was so excited because he talked about, think about how many books a child should read in a school year and multiply that by the number of students that you have. Do you have enough books? And yeah, we will never have enough books, but we do send powerful messages when most of our books are in one language versus partner languages, as we typically call them. Okay, now I will be quiet and I will let you talk.
So what's been our time together? We've just spent the past 3 days talking about translanguaging in different areas, right? We started with translanguaging as social justice, where we were centering bilingual students and working towards equity in schools and classroom. And we had Dr. Seltzer present from Rowan University. She introduced us to translanguaging theory and ways in which it can support our social and emotional identities and contribute to our movement of social justice, right? I loved her policy and practice recommendations of developing multilingual ecologies, the design of culturally, racially, and linguistically instruction, providing PD to further develop and engage this translanguaging stance. Then we were so lucky to also have Dr. Laura Sensi Moreno, and she talked about leveling the playing field, a strength-based multilingual approach to formative reading assessment. And she shared with us about the potential of responsive adaptations. So I'm just trying to remind you of all the great notes you probably took if you've been going through the sessions, through the translanguaging, right? Because there is this change that is needed. We need to change assessment practices for emergent bilinguals. We want to highlight all that they do well. And if we're only looking primarily at one language and not their whole language, we're missing out on a whole piece of what this child needs to bring. So then on our second day, we were grateful that Dr. Mandy Stewart from Texas Woman University talked to us about translanguaging in the ESL and ELA classroom through Readers and Writers Workshop. We got a wealth of knowledge from Dr. Mandy about how bilingual students can use their full linguistic repertoire during Readers and Writers Workshop. I also loved all the multilingual resources, free, and maybe those we might need to ask our districts to buy for our students, that she shared with us. And then we had Dr. Ale Babino from Texas A&M Commerce. And she was talking to us about translanguaging policies and practice for dual language programs. And she helped us envision actions toward that development of policies and practices that incorporate translanguaging that we can do at a campus level, at a district level. And finally, this morning, we had the amazing Dr. Susana Ivara Johnson. Okay, I'm a little biased. She was on my dissertation committee, but I do think she's an amazing author and researcher. She wrote the book Translanguaging Castro with Dr. Ofelia Garcia and Kate Seltzer. That's a book you must go out and get. And then she talked to us about ways to incorporate translanguaging in our preparation for our future students. And I loved the in-person examples she gave of what it looks like. So now where are we? Right? Where do we go from here? I came to this conference. I sat through 3 days of training. What do I do now? I'm not just going to go home and do nothing. If I'm an educator, I have the whole summer. If I'm a district leader, I have this. What can I do? So this is where we're at. Sorry, I get excited and I lose my place. So I'm going to share a little bit of what I did, right? We heard 5 research-based presentations these past couple days. So what do we do next? I'm going to share a little bit of my dissertation of how I was introduced to translanguaging. I was here just not too long ago, right? I had never heard about translanguaging. And I had just finished all my ed leadership doctoral classes at Texas Christian University. And I was going to write about something around dual language. I was a student in dual language. My mom was an educator. I had been in bilingual education all my life. And I happened by this conference at TCU with Yvonne Freeman and David Freeman. And they were talking about translanguaging. And I walk in, I go, ¿qué? ¿Qué están hablando estos señores? And it's the Freeman. So I'm super excited that I was going to meet the Freemans. And I hear like mumbling in the back. They're just talking about code switching and they don't know what they're talking about. I could hear older administrators from districts talking about it in the back. And then I saw the young teachers excited in the front. Yes, this is what we need to learn about. So I sat at this district and I asked Yvonne after the conference, I said, Dr. Freeman, I'm finishing my dissertation. What research is needed for this translanguaging? And translanguaging, when she spoke about it, resonated with me. Because as a teacher, I knew that that's what I was doing when I closed the door. When I closed the door as a teacher, I was teaching the kids in the language they needed at the time, right? Like we might read a book in Spanish and then we all wrote about it in English. And then maybe we did another activity in maybe a multimedial way. So I knew that I just instinctively I was doing it, but now I had a name to what it was. Dr. Castro, you can move me along. I'm a talker. So I'm going to tell you that what I did. So from there, I followed a district in North Texas that were going to implement translanguaging. And I did an ethnographic study on what it was to implement, pilot an implementation of translanguaging. So after all this study, I spent about 1.5 years with this district, following the different teachers, students, and leaders. I came about with, if I were to do it ideally in my world, what would I do differently, or what would I do from what I learned? So this is a sample implementation of what I feel like would be a good way to do it. So the first thing is research. The first thing we need to do is get all the research on what is this new idea, or it's not a new idea. What is this pedagogy, or what is this? So I would recommend starting with the Translanguaging classroom and all of the CUNY guides that are available for free on the website from CUNY. They're amazing guides, how to use them, how to implement it, a dual language, translanguaging in the dual language classroom. They give samples. They give, step by step. They're amazing and they're free. So that's how I would start. And then I would make sure that if you're going to do this, that you develop a shared vision with all your stakeholders. This was an important piece that was missing when that North Texas district was trying to implement this, right? They were missing this shared vision where everyone knew what was going to happen. From the students to the teachers to the principal to the district leaders, right? There was a big disconnect. So that is an important piece that has to happen when you are going to implement translanguaging or anything. So many times district leaders make decisions and have not met or discussed it with the principals and the teachers. And, parents and students are also an important piece to this. The next thing is to start with the data. This isn't something, if you're going to do anything in your district, right? You need to start with your data, right? It has to be data driven. Why, if we've always used this model, why are we changing anything to it, right? What is it saying? Are students not doing well? What are the scores showing? So this is important that when you're doing this process, that's also thought about, right? What is the data showing, and what do we want it to show? And what is the research saying that would be different, right? And then next would be create a plan and share. Make sure all the stakeholders are part of this piloting plan, right? Where they're part of the initial conversation. Ask the students. One thing that this district got a lot of kickback was that the students did not want any change. Why didn't they ask the students? Did they feel they were being successful or not successful? It's important to get everyone on the same page. And then continuous professional development. This is so important because school district leaders need to make sure that their bilingual staff or ESL staff chosen to be part of this plan implement whatever program with understanding of what it is. In this case, translanguaging and how it should look like in the classroom, right? Translanguaging with the social lens, right? Social justice lens. They need to be trained extensively in all aspects of what it is before attempting to use it with students. For example, a complex aspect of translanguaging pedagogy demands that multilingual speakers engaged in translanguaging do not fluctuate between language systems, right? Randomly. It's very strategic, right? So is this being done strategically? Translanguaging is not about code switching, but more about how Dr. Garcia says responsible code switching. Students need to learn with intention and use the knowledge about each language for achieving their goals in the classroom. So teachers, educators must have these skill sets to help students gain that metacognitive understanding of the way their language practices affect their work, right? And the last thing is to use all the external, internal resources, local, regional. You might have a local university who's wanting to work. Dr. Ivara Johnson, maybe she wants to work with a local district and help them implement it. So there's a wealth of educators and groups, organizations that want to help. Reach out to these resources for whatever implementation you want to do. So now I'm passing it back to Dr. Castro. Unmute yourself, Dr. Castro.
It's amazing what technology can do. You can mute and unmute yourself, and once in a while you get it right. So what we want to do now is give you time to think about implementation. So I would like to give you just 30 seconds to look for your notes. If you have joined us for the last 3 days, you might have notes in different places. I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to just look for that. The way I will know you're ready is because I'm going to ask you to write your name, school, and role in the chat. So get your notes first. And when you have your notes with you, write your name, school, and role so that we know that to give you the next set of directions. And also include your quick writes from today, any notes that you took today or when I asked you to take notes. Thank you, Dr. Sulema. Thank you, Dorcas Flowers. I translanguage there. Welcome, Annabelle. Hello, Juan. Welcome, Ruth. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So in a little bit, we're gonna go into breakout rooms. But for now, what I'm gonna ask you to do is review your notes. You're gonna have 5 minutes to do that. What I would like you to do in your notes is highlight or underline ideas that were interesting to you, ideas that you felt like, oh, maybe I could try that. And then just have them separate. Just copy down the ideas in order of personal interest, so you know which one is the top one. Okay, so I'm gonna start the counter now. Right now it's, again, hello, Anna. Now it's time for you just to get organized, review your notes from the last 3 days or notes that you took today. You know, Dr. Piñón did a really nice job of summarizing some of the great ideas, and I gave you some additional research. So just write down the notes and in order of personal interest. The 5 minutes start now.
Oh, and Dr. Castro, they're able to turn off their mics and cams now on the screen.
Ooh, fancy. Excellent. So maybe we'll come back here then after the small groups.
Sounds good.
If you're still taking notes, finish your last thought. We're going to come back together in like about 10 more seconds.
Dr. Castro, I've never been good with wait time.
I have to time myself, so. And then we can go to the next slide. Just so that it's easy for you, I'm going to ask you to put a star by the one idea that you like to share, maybe the one that you wrote at the top. If you did not have a chance to order them, just put a star. And if you use the time to go run to, to the bathroom to powder your nose, then just look through your notes and put a star by one of the ideas that you really like today. And here's what we're going to do now. If you can go to the next slide. I'm going to give you a few seconds to read through these, and then I'll talk to you through it. So
Gracias, Dr. Ivara.
So you have all gonna go into groups. I'm gonna put the directions on they looked a little squished, but you're gonna have 25 minutes. So this is a lot of time. You're gonna be in groups about 4 people. I want to make sure that you have enough time. And what I'm gonna have you do is when we open the breakout rooms, go to a room. If there are already 4 people, go to a different room. We might start like a few seconds late because we might have to move if there's just like 1 or 2 people. So what we're going to have you do is when you get to that group, you're going to do a quick introductions of everybody so that you get to know who is who. I'm also going to ask one person in each group to be the facilitator or timekeeper. So who's going to be the facilitator or timekeeper? I don't want you to spend too much time deciding that. It's going to be the person who had the most coffee in the morning. So I'm going to say, hey, Liz, you're in my group. How many cups of coffee did you have?
3 cafecitos.
3 cafecitos. I don't drink coffee. So she would be the facilitator timekeeper. Okay, so we're going to do this really quick because we don't want to spend more than a minute or so doing that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to share around the idea that was most appealing to you. So the idea that everybody highlighted or the idea that you guys put a little star by it, you're going to share it around. And that is just to get the conversation going. What I really want you to spend time on is these 3 questions that you have here. What resources would you need to implement some of these ideas that you really liked? What do you need? And then what challenges do you foresee? And I know that over the last 3 days, we've heard challenges about buy-in, right? We've heard challenges about how do I have consistency across, challenges about time, about knowing when to do it. So we want you to discuss this, and we want you also to identify who are the stakeholders that you need to get on board for this to happen. Now, again, you're going to have 25 minutes. Again, the directions are on the chat. I want you to show you the next slide, if you don't mind, Dr. Piñón, because I want to say something important. For this to work, so you're going to have about 4 people. It's going to be important. This is the job of the facilitator or timekeeper, that person who had lots of coffee. We wanted you to have lots of energy. Why? Because one of your roles is going to make sure that there are multiple voices that come, right? It's so easy because we're so excited to just talk and talk and talk. So part of your own job is to kind of moderate. Am I taking enough space? Or maybe I haven't occupied enough space. I'm going to take a risk and share. That's why we gave you time to kind of take notes so you can go in prepared. By the way, this is modeling also for working with students in class, right? You give them time to be prepared so that they can have a voice when they come into a room. And if people are not able to self-monitor, that's why we have that facilitator timekeeper. I also want to make sure that there's green light thinking. Yes, we're going to be talking about challenges, and we're going to be talking about how we solve those challenges. This is a time to just get ideas. You have peers who have heard similar information that you have, and that may have some strategies that you might not have. So rather than spending too much time on the challenges, again, facilitators, let's try to keep the conversation moving so that we get as many ideas. Right now, the power is going to be that you're going to have about 4 people in each group that have come with multiple different experiences and expertise. The goal of this is to go for deeper understanding. If you come out with just a list of things to do, it's not going to be as powerful as if you come back with a list with ideas and really deep understanding of what those ideas mean, how might you get other people on board, the challenges, and how you're going to solve them. And finally, this is also time to build together. So again, rather than going list by list, if you have something to add, try to add on people's ideas or ask questions for clarification, invite others into the conversation. So those are just 4 norms for you to play with so that we can get as much information. And it's 25 minutes. It sounds like it's a long time. We will be going in and out of rooms just to make sure that is enough time, or if that's too much time, we'll kind of check. I want to know, before we send you to rooms, if there are any questions that you might have, and feel free to either write them on the chat or unmute yourself and let us know if you have questions.
Yes, we're back.
Everybody's here?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, welcome back. It's so odd because I can't see everybody. So you said, Liz, that now they can turn their cameras on. Can we see
that's what the moderator told us.
Okay. Can people try to turn on their cameras and see if we can see you? Otherwise, we'll have the debriefing in one of the breakout rooms.
On my computer, I don't see
the camera. So,
right.
So, Liz, is it okay if we go into like one?
Yes.
We'll all go in a single breakout room so that we can debrief the activity. So we'll see you in a breakout room.
Okay.
We'll push you all to one.